My husband is a true mama's boy. When I first met Kevin, he was everything I had dreamed of in a partner: kind, attentive, and endlessly charming. Our courtship felt like a whirlwind romance, filled with laughter and plans for a shared future. Yet, even in those early days, there was an unspoken presence in our relationship: his mother, Margaret. She was always there, her influence subtly woven into Kevin's every decision. I convinced myself it was endearing, proof of his loyalty and family values. As we grew closer, though, her shadow loomed larger. Margaret's voice had a way of echoing through our lives, from what Kevin ordered at dinner to the career choices he contemplated. I remember questioning whether her constant involvement would always be there. But Kevin's reassurances soothed my concerns. "Once we're married, it'll be different," he promised with a smile. I believed him, hopeful that marriage would create a boundary, carving out a space that was truly ours. Yet, deep down, there was a nagging doubt I couldn't shake. Looking back now, I realized those early misgivings weren't just fleeting fears, they were warnings I had chosen to ignore. After the wedding, I had hoped Kevin and I could start fresh, building our own life together, free from outside interference. That dream was shattered the moment Kevin announced, without much discussion, that we'd be moving into a house just a few streets away from Margaret. "It'll be great," he said with that boyish grin of his, as if proximity to his mother was a selling point. My objections were brushed aside, drowned out by his insistence that this arrangement was practical and temporary. It didn't take long for Margaret to make her presence known. She strolled into our home unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, armed with paint swatches for the living room. "This beige is so dreary," she declared, holding up a bright yellow sample. Before I could respond, Kevin chimed in, "Mom has great taste. Maybe we should listen to her." Days later, the living room had been transformed into a color I loathed, and the kitchen had been entirely reorganized to Margaret's liking. My spices, once carefully arranged, were now scattered in a way that made cooking a nightmare. I tried to talk to Kevin, hoping he'd understand how intrusive Margaret was being. His response was infuriatingly dismissive. "Mom just wants to help." "You're overthinking this," he said, his tone light, as if my frustrations were trivial. But they weren't. Each of Margaret's unsolicited changes felt like a violation of my space, a reminder that our home wasn't truly ours. The breaking point came when Margaret demanded a copy of our house keys. "It's just for emergencies," she explained with a sweet but insistent tone. I balked, knowing that Margaret's definition of an emergency likely included reorganizing our closets or showing up uninvited for coffee. When I refused, Kevin stepped in. "Why are you being so difficult? She's my mom," he said, handing her the spare key himself. I felt betrayed, watching the boundary I tried to set crumble under Kevin's loyalty to his mother. The tension between Margaret and me simmered beneath the surface, erupting in small but sharp confrontations. She'd criticize my cooking or suggest I wasn't keeping the house clean enough, always under the guise of helpfulness. "You'll get the hang of it one day," she'd say with a patronizing smile that made my blood boil. Kevin, oblivious or unwilling to confront the problem, always took her side. "She's just trying to help," he repeated like a mantra, blind to how much her interference was driving a wedge between us. Every day, I felt more like a guest in my own home, the walls closing in under the weight of Margaret's control and Kevin's indifference. Our marriage, once full of promise, now felt like a battleground where I was always outnumbered. When I found out I was pregnant, I was filled with cautious optimism. Surely, this would be the moment Kevin would shift his focus to our growing family. A child would make him realize that our lives needed to revolve around our own little unit, not the constant orbit around Margaret. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe this new chapter would bring us closer. But the fantasy was short-lived. As soon as Kevin told Margaret about the pregnancy, she took it upon herself to insert her opinions into every aspect of it. "You must name the baby after your grandfather," she declared at our first dinner after the announcement, as though it were already decided. When I hesitated, offering a few names I had loved for years, Margaret waved me off. "Those sound too modern. A baby needs a name with history, with substance." From that point on, Margaret's involvement grew more suffocating. She appeared at our doorstep unannounced, arms laden with baby books and fabric swatches for the nursery. "This blue is calming," she said, holding up a pastel fabric. You don't want the baby overstimulated, do you? Any suggestion I made, whether about colors, themes, or even where the crib should go, was met with subtle condescension. Oh, sweetheart, she'd say, her tone syrupy but sharp, you'll understand these things better when you've been a mother for as long as I have. Her advice quickly turned into thinly veiled criticism. She questioned my diet, berated me for not taking long enough walks, and even suggested I wasn't taking the pregnancy seriously because I had chosen a midwife instead of an OB/GYN she approved of. You're so young, she said once, shaking her head. You need someone experienced to guide you through this. I turned to Kevin, hoping he would finally set boundaries. Instead, he shrugged, that same boyish grin plastered on his face. Mom just wants to help, he said, as if this was meant to reassure me. Let's not make a big deal out of it. His passivity cut deeper than Margaret's interference. It wasn't just that he wouldn't stand up to her, it was that he refused to see how much her actions hurt me. Every time I brought it up, his response was the same, just let it go. She means well. As my belly grew, so did Margaret's presence in our lives. She began arriving with lists of must-dos and must-haves, handing them to me as though I were her assistant rather than the mother-to-be. She rearranged the nursery I had painstakingly set up, replacing items I had chosen with ones she deemed more appropriate. She even criticized the stroller Kevin and I had picked out together, calling it impractical and ordering a different model without consulting me. When it arrived, Kevin helped her assemble it, completely ignoring my protests. Margaret's intrusions weren't confined to objects and plans. She made it clear that she doubted my ability to be a good mother. You'll need me here for at least the first month, she announced one evening, completely disregarding the plans Kevin and I had discussed for our first weeks as parents. You'll be overwhelmed, and you'll need someone experienced to take charge. Her words stung, laced with an assumption that I wasn't capable of handling motherhood on my own. The worst part was how alone I felt in all of it. Kevin, who should have been my partner, my advocate, was nowhere to be found emotionally. Every time I voiced my concerns, he dismissed them, telling me not to take things so personally. She's excited about the baby, he'd say, as if that excused her every overstep. You should be grateful she cares so much. Grateful. The word echoed in my mind as I sat alone in the half-finished nursery one evening, staring at the crib Margaret had chosen without my input. I felt anything but grateful. I felt trapped, overshadowed in my own home by a woman who seemed determined to claim my role before I even had the chance to embrace it. And Kevin's refusal to see my side, to stand with me instead of against me, only deepened the chasm between us. As the weeks passed, my resentment grew. I resented Margaret for her constant meddling, her unrelenting need to control every aspect of my pregnancy. But more than that, I resented Kevin for his complacency, for allowing her to dominate our lives without so much as a word of support for me. I had never felt so isolated, so invisible in my own marriage. This was supposed to be a time of joy, of anticipation for the family we were building. Instead, it felt like I was fighting a losing battle, alone in a war I hadn't signed up for. The baby wasn't even here yet, and already, I feared the dynamic would only worsen. If Kevin couldn't set boundaries now, how would he protect our family in the future? The question lingered in my mind, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. It wasn't just Margaret I was up against, it was the realization that Kevin might never truly see me as his partner, not when his mother's shadow loomed so large over our lives. Sophie's arrival was supposed to be the culmination of a journey, months of anticipation, sacrifices, and countless dreams of becoming a family. I had envisioned those first moments as sacred, a time for Kevin and me to bond with our newborn daughter. Instead, the day of Sophie's birth felt like a battleground, with me caught in the middle of a war I had no hope of winning. From the moment we arrived at the hospital, Margaret made her presence known. She strode into the room with a determination that left no room for negotiation, carrying bags of snacks, magazines, and unsolicited advice. I'm here for moral support, she announced, ignoring the incredulous look I gave Kevin. I pulled him aside, my voice hushed but firm. I don't want her in the delivery room. This is supposed to be our moment, not hers. Kevin hesitated, his gaze darting between me and his mother. She just wants to be there for us, he said weakly, as though that justified the invasion of what should have been an intimate experience. I felt a pang of betrayal as he added, let's not make a big deal out of this. When the time came, Margaret stood at the foot of the bed, barking instructions to the nurses and offering me unsolicited encouragement. I felt exposed, robbed of the privacy I desperately craved. Even as I held Sophie for the first time, my joy was tinged with bitterness, the memory of Margaret's unwelcome presence overshadowing what should have been a perfect moment. The days that followed were no better. Margaret stationed herself in our home as though she were the third parent, not a guest. She took charge of everything, feeding schedules, diaper changes, even which outfits Sophie should wear. "This color brings out her eyes," she'd declare, bypassing the clothes I had carefully chosen. She dismissed my every effort to assert myself as Sophie's mother, brushing me aside with phrases like, "Trust me, I've done this before," or, "You'll thank me later." Her interference extended to Sophie's care in ways that left me seething. If I tried to put Sophie down for a nap, Margaret would swoop in, insisting that her method was better. When I chose a specific formula for Sophie, Margaret replaced it with a brand she deemed superior. Every decision I made felt invalidated, every boundary I set ignored. My confidence as a mother began to erode under the constant weight of her criticism. I turned to Kevin, desperate for support. "She's taking over everything," I said one evening as we sat in the nursery. "I don't feel like Sophie's mother, I feel like a spectator in my own child's life." Kevin sighed, his expression weary. "Mom's just trying to help," he said, the same tired refrain I'd heard 100 times before. "You're being too sensitive." Too sensitive. The word stung. "She's undermining me at every turn. I can't even make a decision without her stepping in." He rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze. "You should be grateful she's here. Do you know how many women would kill for this kind of help?" Grateful. The word hit me like a slap. How could I be grateful for someone who made me feel invisible in my own home? I stared at Kevin, searching his face for even a flicker of understanding. But all I saw was his unwavering loyalty to Margaret. At that moment, I realized how deep the chasm between us had grown. He wasn't just failing to defend me, he was actively choosing his mother over me. Over our marriage. The confrontation ended with me retreating to our bedroom, Sophie cradled in my arms. I felt defeated, drowning in a sea of resentment and loneliness. The man who had vowed to stand by me, to build a life with me, had become a stranger, an accomplice to the very person tearing us apart. As I watched Sophie sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling, I resolved that I wouldn't let Margaret, or Kevin, strip me of my role as her mother. But deep down, I wondered how much more I could endure before I reached my breaking point. The tension in our home became suffocating, like a storm that refused to pass. I tried, time and time again, to establish boundaries with Margaret, but she brushed them aside as though they were suggestions meant for someone else. She showed up unannounced, armed with unsolicited advice and a critical eye. If I was folding laundry, she'd point out how I missed a wrinkle. If Sophie fussed, Margaret would swoop in, declaring, "Let Grandma handle it. She knows best." Each comment chipped away at my confidence, leaving me questioning my every decision. Margaret's presence began to loom over every corner of our lives. It wasn't just the frequent, unwelcome visits or the constant second-guessing. It was the way she subtly positioned herself as Sophie's authority figure, relegating me to the role of an inexperienced bystander. "Your mommy doesn't understand," she once said to Sophie, as if the baby could comprehend her words. "Grandma knows how to make you happy." Though Sophie was too young to understand, the implication stung deeply, planting seeds of doubt I couldn't shake. Kevin's role in all of this only made things worse. At first, his inaction felt like betrayal. He didn't defend me when Margaret overstepped, he simply watched, passive and indifferent. But soon, his passivity turned into active complicity. Margaret's criticisms began filtering through him like poisoned arrows. "Mom thinks you should spend less time worrying about the house and more time with Sophie," he'd say, or, "Maybe you should take Mom's advice on how to get Sophie to sleep through the night." Each comment was a reminder that I was not just battling Margaret, I was battling my own husband, who had chosen his mother's side. I felt trapped. The home that was supposed to be my sanctuary now felt like a battleground, every room carrying the weight of Margaret's disapproval. I tried to fight back, asserting my authority as Sophie's mother and the woman of the house. I told Kevin that Margaret needed to call before coming over, but the very next day, she waltzed in without warning, as though my words were meaningless. "This is family," she said with a saccharine smile. "Family doesn't need permission." Kevin's support, or lack thereof, made me feel more isolated than ever. Any attempt to express my frustration was met with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Mom's just trying to help," he'd say, his voice tinged with exasperation. "You're overreacting." Overreacting. The word burned. I wanted to scream that my feelings were valid, that I wasn't the villain for wanting to carve out space for myself and my family. But Kevin refused to see it. To him, Margaret's meddling was love, her criticisms were concern, and my resistance was ingratitude. The weight of it all became unbearable. My efforts to establish myself as a capable wife and mother were continually dismissed. My authority eroded by Margaret's interference and Kevin's blind loyalty. I felt invisible, reduced to a figure who cooked, cleaned, and bore the brunt of their judgments. Even Sophie, my precious daughter, seemed to be slipping from my grasp, as Margaret claimed more and more of her time and affection. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more I could take. The storm inside our home was relentless, and I was drowning in it. My voice felt small, my presence insignificant, and my dreams of a happy, independent family life seemed further away with each passing day. In the quiet of those sleepless nights, I began to question not just my marriage, but my place in the very life I had worked so hard to build. Sophie's first birthday party was supposed to be a celebration of our daughter's milestone, a day filled with love, laughter, and memories for our little family. But from the moment Margaret stepped in, it became clear that the event was no longer about Sophie. The decorations, handpicked by me to reflect Sophie's favorite colors and characters, were swapped out for elaborate arrangements chosen by Margaret. The cake I had carefully ordered was replaced with a towering confection that seemed more suited to a wedding than a baby's birthday. Even the guest list had grown, with Margaret inviting her friends and acquaintances, turning the event into a spectacle rather than an intimate gathering. As the party unfolded, my unease grew. Margaret basked in the attention, acting as though she were the host. She guided guests around the house, showcasing her contributions to the party, and even gave a speech about how much Sophie meant to her family. I felt invisible, reduced to a mere spectator in my own home. My attempts to reclaim the day for Sophie were met with resistance. When I tried to rearrange the decorations or redirect the focus back to the birthday girl, Margaret brushed me off with a saccharine smile. "Don't worry, dear," she said. "I've got everything under control." The final straw came when Margaret insisted on opening Sophie's gifts herself, narrating each unwrapping as if she were the proud parent. "That's enough," I said firmly, stepping forward to reclaim my role. But before I could take another step, Margaret turned to me, her smile fading into a look of pure condescension. "You're being controlled again," she said sharply. "Why can't you just be grateful for all the help I've given you?" Her words ignited a fire within me, one that had been smoldering for far too long. "Grateful?" I snapped. "For what?" "For hijacking my daughter's birthday. For constantly undermining me as a mother. For turning every moment of my life into a stage for you." Margaret's expression hardened, but before she could respond, Kevin stepped in. "This isn't the time for this," he said, his tone pleading. "Mom didn't mean anything by it. She's just trying to help." I turned to him, my voice trembling with frustration. "Help? All she's done is take over, Kevin. And you let her. You always let her." The room fell silent as our argument escalated. The guests now an audience to our unraveling. "You're ruining this day," Margaret interjected, her voice laced with accusation. "Why can't you just let it go?" "Because I'm tired of letting it go," I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Kevin, you're so blinded by her that you can't see what it's doing to us. You're a mama's boy, and it's tearing our marriage apart." The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Kevin's face turned red, not with shame but with anger. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's my mother, and she's done more for this family than you ever acknowledge." The betrayal in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked around the room, at the family and friends who had gathered to celebrate Sophie, and all I saw were their stunned expressions. The humiliation was unbearable, a weight pressing down on my chest. Margaret stood tall, victorious in the silence that followed. Kevin remained by her side, his loyalty clear. I felt alone, devastated by the realization that the very person who was supposed to stand by me had chosen her, yet again. Sophie, oblivious to the chaos around her, giggled in her high chair. A heartbreaking reminder of the innocence caught in the crossfire. As the party continued around me, I retreated into myself, feeling the walls of my home, once a sanctuary, closing in. The day that should have been filled with joy and celebration had become a painful reminder of the fractures in my family, fractures that seemed impossible to mend. I turned to Clara, my best friend and confidant, in a moment of desperation. Over coffee at her kitchen table, I poured out the frustrations and humiliations that had become my daily life. Clara listened intently. Her sharp gaze fixed on me as I described Margaret's constant intrusions and Kevin's unwavering allegiance to his mother. When I finished, her response was firm and unflinching. "You can't keep living like this," she said. "You need to stand your ground. If Kevin won't prioritize you and Sophie, you'll have to make him understand." Her words lingered with me long after I left her house. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of clarity amidst the fog of doubt and resentment. That evening, while Sophie slept peacefully in her crib, I sat in front of my laptop and began to research the dynamics of mama's boys and their effect on marriages. Article after article mirrored my experience: wives sidelined, boundaries ignored, marriages crumbling under the weight of misplaced loyalty. The more I read, the more I understood that my feelings of being undervalued and unheard were not isolated. They were the result of a deeply ingrained pattern that I could no longer ignore. By the time dawn broke, I knew what I had to do. For years, I had bent over backward to maintain a semblance of harmony, sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of a marriage that felt increasingly one-sided. But now, I saw the truth with painful clarity: if I didn't take decisive action, I would lose myself entirely. And worse, Sophie would grow up witnessing a mother who accepted less than she deserved. It was time to reclaim my voice, not just for me, but for the future I wanted to build for my daughter. The realization was equal parts terrifying and empowering, a catalyst for the changes I knew were inevitable. The tension in the house reached a breaking point as I finally confronted Kevin with an ultimatum: prioritize our marriage or risk losing it altogether. My voice was steady, but my heart pounded as I laid everything bare. I wasn't willing to live in Margaret's shadow any longer, nor would I let Sophie grow up in a home where her mother's worth was constantly undermined. "This is your chance to prove where your loyalties truly lie," I said, the weight of my words hanging heavily between us. Kevin's face contorted with indecision. He mumbled something about needing time to think. But his reluctance to commit spoke louder than any words could. The very hesitation that had plagued our marriage, the inability to separate from his mother's control, was once again the answer I didn't want to hear. His silence was a choice, and it wasn't me he was choosing. When Margaret learned of my ultimatum, her reaction was as predictable as it was infuriating. She leaned into her role as the self-sacrificing matriarch, guilt-tripping Kevin with lines like, "I'm your mother. I sacrificed everything for you." Her words wrapped around him like chains, pulling him further away from the family we had tried to build together. Kevin seemed trapped, unwilling or unable to break free. As the days stretched into weeks with no change in Kevin's behavior, I began to steel myself for what was to come. Quietly, I started preparing for life as a single mother. I began sorting through our finances, researching childcare options, and imagining a future where Sophie and I could find peace without the constant intrusion of Margaret's presence. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Kevin's inaction had left me no choice but to take control of my own life. The evening started like any other, the quiet hum of the television filling the background as I folded laundry in the bedroom. Margaret had come over, unannounced as usual, and cornered me in the kitchen. Her words were sharp, slicing through any pretense of civility. "You've always been unworthy of this family," she said coldly, her voice low but laced with venom. "Kevin deserves someone who truly understands what it means to put family first, not someone who tears it apart." I stood frozen, my chest tightening with the weight of her accusations. The years of resentment I had buried threatened to bubble over, but I bit my tongue. I had learned that fighting Margaret was like shouting into a void. Her self-righteousness always drowned out reason. What I didn't realize was that Kevin had returned from his evening run earlier than expected and was standing just outside the kitchen door. When he stepped into the room, his face was pale, his jaw tight. "Mom, what did you just say?" he demanded, his voice trembling, not with uncertainty but with anger. Margaret's expression shifted instantly, feigning innocence as she stumbled over her words. "I was just trying to help," she said, her eyes welling with crocodile tears. "You know I only want what's best for you." But Kevin didn't back down. For the first time, he truly saw the toxic dynamic that had festered between us all these years. "This has to stop," he said firmly, his voice steady. "You don't get to treat my wife like this. If you can't respect her, you're not welcome in our home." Margaret gasped, clutching her chest as though he'd struck her. She played the part of the wounded mother perfectly, tears streaming as she muttered about sacrifice and betrayal. But Kevin remained unmoved, standing his ground. For the first time, he chose me, our marriage, our family, and refused to let his mother's manipulation dictate our lives any longer. Kevin's apology came with a weight I hadn't expected. His voice cracked as he admitted his failures, each word a painful acknowledgement of the damage done. "I let you down," he said, his eyes heavy with regret. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if this was just another fleeting promise, but something in his expression told me he was finally beginning to see the depth of what he had overlooked. We began attending couples counseling, a step that felt both daunting and necessary. In those sessions, Kevin confronted his unhealthy attachment to Margaret, peeling back layers of guilt and obligation he hadn't even realized were there. The counselor's questions forced him to reflect on years of misplaced priorities, and for the first time, I felt like he was truly listening, not just to me, but to himself. With guidance, we established boundaries that seemed impossible before. Margaret was no longer allowed to visit unannounced, and Kevin promised to place our marriage above all else. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, an indication that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild the trust that had been lost.